Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is a viciously intense, stalked in the woods on a mountainous location type of story. I think you guys are going to really enjoy this. Please do, of course, let me know down below what you think in the comments section. I do believe this could pertain to a Dogman story, but it's never mentioned. Certainly some of the descriptions fit the bill. Please do let me know down below your thoughts, of course. And please do like and share. And without further ado, let's get into tonight's story, entitled Echoes in the Mountains. Let's get straight into that. Mike! Mike! Hey, Mike! What? I yelled, pulling the headphones off my ears. Alan stood sheepishly in my doorway, scratching the back of his head. Hey, have you seen Daisy around anywhere? I arched my eyebrow curiously at him. No, not since this morning. She's probably lying on Mum's bed. No, I already checked there. She's not downstairs or in the basement either. Well, did you let her outside at all? I asked. I mean, not exactly, but I did run outside to grab my gloves from the shed, but I only left the door open for like a minute. Jesus Christ, Alan, why would you do that? It's like 30 degrees out. You shouldn't be leaving the door open anyways. I was only out for a minute, he responded. I didn't mean to let her out or anything. I sighed heavily and tried to stay calm. Getting mad wouldn't do me any good. Alan was only 12. He should know better, but it's not like he wanted to let Daisy out. It was all probably a moot point anyways. Alright, I'll go check downstairs real quick. I got up from my bed and marched down the stairs, Alan following closely behind. In the kitchen, I peered through the glass sliding door, and sure enough, saw two sets of footprints in the freshly fallen snow. One, a child's boots leading to and from the shed, and the other, a set of paw prints dashing madly into the woods. Well, shit. It looks like she's gone straight up for Mount Byron, I said. Alan only let out a defeated sigh in response. We lived in rural Vermont, on the back road about 5 miles from the nearest town centre. It was a nice quiet house with spectacular views. The best, of course, was Mount Byron, a 1,500-foot mountain, just a short hike through the woods away from our backyard. I spent my entire childhood playing and hiking in the woods on and around the mountain, mapping out every trail, brook and cool rock formation. It was also a favourite of Daisy's, and whenever she would sprint away into the woods, we could reliably find her lounging about at the top of the mountain later that day. I was used to the hike to go get her, but it was a chore, especially considering the snow we had got on the previous night. It was only 2 inches, a dusting by our standards, but it would make this trail all the more treacherous to hike. Okay, Alan, go get your coat. I'll throw some supplies in my backpack, I said with a defeated sigh. We're actually going out? Isn't it dangerous with all this snow? It's only a few inches, I said. You've done this before in the winter. Yeah, but Mum and Dad were both with us, he said, his voice growing softer than usual. And besides, what if Daisy comes home while we're up there? Then Mum will let her in, and when she gets back from her work. Come on, the sooner we leave, the sooner we'll get back. With a huff, Alan marched to grab his snow gear while I went back to my room to grab some miscellaneous supplies. Luckily, I still had my hiking bag packed from the summer. It had most of the essentials: a map, compass, first aid kit and emergency blanket. I also decided to throw in a few granola bars, some dog treats, Daisy's leash and 2 water bottles for the both of us. When I walked downstairs, Alan looked ready to go at the door. I wrote a small note for our mum, explaining where we had gone. The winter air was milder than I had expected. It might have been above freezing, for better or for worse. Solid ice and melting ice presented separate but unique challenges. But for the time being, I was just glad the hike wouldn't be too harsh on my face. It was still an overcast sky, and I worried that it might begin to snow again while we were on the mountain. The forecast for the day only gave about 30% chance, but it was still something to be mindful of. Alan and I marched in parallel with Daisy's tracks, quickly reaching the tree line. The canopy had protected the woods from the worst of the snow, with only a thin layer appearing on the ground. This made the path easier to walk, but there were some downsides. Daisy's tracks became hard to make out with the thinner snow, and the shadows of the trees made it harder to see on what was already a gloomy day. Luckily, both Alan and I had been using this trail since we were children, and inclement conditions only seemed like a slight nuisance. Losing Daisy's tracks would be unfortunate, but she had probably taken the same trail we always take to reach the summit. Half a mile through the woods to the main hiking trail, and another 2/3 of a mile to reach the summit. Some light bouldering near the top, and a single brook crossing would be the biggest challenge, but nothing I didn't think we could handle. We walked in silence for the first 15 minutes of our journey. I led the way while Alan stayed close behind. It was plain to see that he was upset about letting Daisy out, and I figured it was best to just let him fume himself out for a while. No use in scolding him while he was helping to find her. Still, it was starting to become awkward, and I was trying to think of a way to break this prolonged silence. "Hey Mike, I'm sorry about letting Daisy out. The sudden noise caught me off guard, and I almost stumbled over a rock in my path. It's alright. You just have to be more careful in the future. We're all responsible for her." "I know," he said, his head turned to the ground. "It's just, Mum is going to scream at me when I get home, even though I've already feel bad about it." I sighed a little. "I know, dude, but she just wants to make sure you understand. Things have been difficult for her the last year. They've been hard on all of us." "Why'd you always take her side?" he asked with disdain. "I'm not taking her side. I just want you to understand her side, It's hard being responsible for other living things, especially when you're not expecting it all at once. I guess I'm sorry I'm a responsibility for you now." "Alan, come on. You know I don't mean it like that." Suddenly, a howling noise came crashing over the forest, silencing both me and Alan. We stopped in our tracks, listening intently at the noise slowly beginning to fade with weaker and weaker echoes. It was followed in quick succession by 2 more howls. There was no way to tell where they were coming from, but it sounded like the same animal was making the noises. We waited several seconds after the final howl ended before speaking again. What was that? Like a wolf or something?" Alan asked. "There aren't any wolves in Vermont," I spoke absently. "Then what the hell was it?" Alan prodded again. I suddenly snapped back to my senses. "I don't know. It was probably like a husky or something. Everyone in this fucking state has huskies." "Are you sure? I mean, what else could it be? Either way, it didn't sound like it was anywhere near us. Let's just keep going." Alan began following me again, although I noticed that he was frequently checking the woods around us for anything out of the ordinary. We heard the howling once more after that, this time sounding much more distant than before. Neither of us broke stride as we heard it. After another 10 minutes, we reached the trail leading up the mountain. The hike became much more difficult as our path began to arch uphill, but we kept a decent pace. Alan, to his credit, didn't complain and tried his best to keep up, but I could tell he was getting tired. Truth be told, I was getting tired. We were both moved slowly on greater inclines, careful of any ice that might be hiding underneath the snow. I felt myself lose footing twice, but both times I managed to catch myself. Alan fell on his back once, but propped right back up, unharmed by the spill. Eventually, we reached what would be the biggest obstacle in our path, Becker's Creek. It was about 12 feet across, cutting directly through the trail. The stream was flowing gently, the snow having started melting this morning. It was deceptively deep, however, and cold enough to be a genuine danger. On top of this, the rocks that were typically hopped across to the other side were all covered in snow, and likely ice as well. I went across first, slowly stepping from one rock to the other, carefully securing my first foot before moving with my second. At each rock, I quickly brushed away the excess snow to give Alan an easier path to cross. I reached the other side and turned around to see Alan nervously eyeing the path I had cleared for him. He took his first step, and carefully as I had, before lunging with the rest of his body to the other rock. Feeling more secure after the first step, he proceeded to make his way across the stream, before stopping on the final rock. The gap between this rock and the other side was no issue for me, but for Alan, he was too short to step across it. With a heavy sigh and a steeled look, he leapt forward. His feet caught the edge of the riverbank, but he landed off balance. He started leaning backwards, waving his arms frantically. I quickly grabbed his arm and yanked him forward. "Thanks, Mike," he said, breathing heavily from the jump. "Yeah, no problem. Tell you what, do you want to take a quick break? I bought some snacks in the bag." He nodded eagerly at me, and I quickly tossed a granola bar at him. We cleared the snow off a small rock before sitting down. Alan tore into his food while I took a few sips from my water bottle. The conditions outside had kept it cold, and it felt soothing as it ran down my dried out throat. Alan continued to eat almost every bit of food I'd packed as I leaned back against the rock and took in the sights of nature. It was early in the season for snow, so animals were still very, very active. A group of birds could be heard chirping in the background, and as I saw another pair fly off from the branch they had perched in, farther back, I heard the light crunching of snow and saw a family of deer running. It looked like a doe, followed by about 3 fawns. They were frantically sprinting down the mountain, bounding easily over a narrow part of the brook. I had never seen deer run like this, except when my dad used to take me hunting. It was a genuinely curious sight. I would have thought about it longer, but I could tell that Alan was beginning to get impatient. So I made the decision to get up and continue on our way. A sharp breeze slapped me in the face as we continued to hike upward. "Hey Alan, we might want to start hoofing it. I think we might be getting another snowstorm." "What did the forecast say?" Alan asked. "About a 30% chance," I answered. "But looking at this breeze and those clouds, I wouldn't be surprised if it starts snowing before we make it home again." Alan began surveying the skies. "That makes sense. I guess I never really thought to check." "Yeah, it's just something that Dad used to tell me to be mindful of when we went out on hikes." "Oh," Alan's voice drifted off. I took a deep breath and began to pick up my pace with Alan doing the same behind me. The footing was still treacherous and I felt myself almost slip several times. Still, we were covering distance quicker than I expected. Within 20 minutes we had reached the small bouldering section that led to the summit. This was relatively a small climb, less than 40 feet, with convenient grips and stops along the way. Once again, I went first, carefully clearing the snow away for Alan as I moved. I reached the top with relative ease, but as I leaned against a tree, I felt suddenly out of breath. Alan had followed me up the entire way and seemed almost energized by the climb. "You doing okay, Mike?" he asked with a smirk. I rolled my eyes. "I cleared the way for you. Come on, let's grab Daisy and get back." The summit was a large area with almost 0 trees, but an assortment of boulders jutting out every which way you obscure your vision. Alan and I split up and began calling for Daisy at the top of our lungs. Our voices carried far and I could hear the echoes bounce back from the valleys below. We each circled round a different side of the summit, covering as much ground as we could. I couldn't find a trace of her. There was no barking, no tuft of brown fur sticking out against the snow, not even the sound of paws smacking against the snow. I continued to yell, but my voice was beginning to get hoarse in the dry winter air. Taking a pause from yelling, I grabbed my water bottle and again took a sip. I almost choked when I heard a scream come from the other side of the summit. "Alan!" Not even pausing to close the water bottle, I turned and began sprinting towards his voice, and it took me only 15 seconds to blow past the boulders and bushes to find Alan, pale-faced and bug-eyed. He'd gone silent, his hands cupping his mouth. Seeing he was unharmed, I twisted my head to see what had startled him. It took me a moment to comprehend the sight. A mess of blood and gore lay in a chaotic pile in front of us. Surrounding it was a crown of deep crimson blood staining that once pristine snow in haphazard splotches. Organs spilled out along the side of the pile, emerging from an enormous hole in what must have been this animal's torso. Its brown fur was caked in blood, and its limbs, well, They stuck out at painful and unnatural positions. The head that had been smashed and torn, which normally would have made it difficult to identify this animal, but with its size, there was no mistaking it. This had been a fully grown moose, female, likely, judging from the lack of antlers, but a behemoth nonetheless. So sorry for screaming. I was just... Alan attempted to speak. It's all right, I get it. I made a gesture for Alan to calm down, while I took a cautious step forward. There was no real smell coming off the corpse, at least nothing strong, making me uneasy as I approached. Carefully avoiding the largest patches of gore, I knelt next to the corpse and removed one of my gloves, before sticking my index finger in a small pool of blood and confirming my worst fear. The blood was still lukewarm, a far cry from the chilly conditions on the summit. "Come on, Alan, we should get heading back right now," I said while standing up. Alan gave me a concerned look. "But what about Daisy?" "I didn't see her on the other side, so I don't think she's up here. She's probably already ran down a different trail, and we've missed her. It's going to be dark soon, and I don't want us to stay out too late." "You really think she ran back down?" Alan asked, eyeing the moose's corpse nervously. "She's definitely not up here. Come on, we're going to need to take the south trail down. I don't want to have to cross the Beckers again." "Okay." I took one final look back to make sure Alan was following me. As I did this, a small detail caught my eye. The footprints around the corpse were a mess, clearly signs that the moose had struggled until the very end. However, on the left side, there was a pair of prints that had been left undisturbed by the struggle. Even with the cursory glance, I could tell that these were massive paw prints. My first instinct was a bear, but that made no sense. The only bears in Vermont were black bears, and they would never pick a fight with a moose. Nothing else was big enough to leave those prints. I kept my concerns to myself, making sure to keep Alan close by. He was being very quiet, clearly disturbed by what he'd seen. We'd never had to worry about wildlife on Mount Byron before. I think the worst I'd ever seen was a fisher cat. This wasn't just unusual, this was unheard of. Something big and aggressive enough to tear a moose apart. I shook my head and continued on the path forward. The south trail was longer than the one we had taken up, but it was a gentler incline, making it better to descend in the snow. True to my prediction from earlier, I felt a snowflake trap against my head, not even 5 minutes into the hike. Soon it was descending steadily. Nothing dangerous, but enough to limit our vision, enough to make me worry. On and on Alan and I trekked, neither of us speaking a word. Tension grew in the air as we both became increasingly unnerved by our surroundings. A trail that we had hiked 1,000 times suddenly felt alien and hostile. What should have been ambient noise was suddenly 1,000 different alarm bells in my ears. Every bird call, every branch rustling, every loose piece of gravel crunching beneath the snow. I flinched as I heard a chipmunk scramble up a tree. Alan was even worse. His eyes were constantly darting at every noise, and he would occasionally stop moving altogether, distracted by whatever he had heard in his periphery. I would tug him along, but he remained distracted. We were moving way too slow. The sun was setting fast, and our visibility was already terrible. In the next 45 minutes, it would be completely dark. My breathing grew heavier, and I gripped tightly at Alan's arm as a new feeling overtook me. The feeling that we were being watched. It was overpowering. My chest tightened, and my footsteps became irregular lurches forward. It was like a force was pressing down over my entire body. I tried to turn my head, but my neck resisted. Fear gripped my mind, and I felt my arms begin to shake. There was something here, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I could feel Alan's eyes on me, looking desperately for reassurance. Finally, I managed to twist my head back. The trail was dark, barely any sunlight left. Trees stood as black silhouettes against the white landscape, as snow continued to block my vision. None of this mattered. Behind me, cutting through all the snow and brush, were two large yellow eyes. I turned my head quickly and rushed forward, pulling Alan behind me. Up ahead was a large boulder. As we passed it, I jerked it aside and threw us both behind it. Alan yelped silently, but seemed more startled than anything. I pressed my hand over his mouth and gave him a look to be quiet. He nodded in confirmation. As soon, both of us was listening intently. I tried and tried, but failed to hear anything behind me. Just as I was ready to give up, the light crunch of snow drifted past. It was approaching slowly. "Alan, I'm going to need you to stay calm, okay? There's something following us behind." I spoke in a hushed tone. Alan's eyes bugged out, but he kept his voice low. What is it?" The snow crunched again. This time, it was louder. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head defeatedly. I think it's that thing that attacked the moose on the summit, but I'm not sure, and..." "What are we going to do?" Alan asked frantically. I could see that he was beginning to cry. "I don't know, okay? I'm just trying to think right now." Crunch. "What would Dad do? He knew how to handle this stuff. He could have... Alan was panicking. "I don't know," I hissed angrily. "Dad's not here, all right? We need to think of something. Fucking anything." Crunch. Alan was now quietly sobbing to himself, as I slowly realised I was hyperventilating. Dad would have known what to do, but I wasn't Dad. I didn't need to be constantly reminded about that. He would have immediately jumped into action. Nothing ever fazed him. Why the fuck couldn't I do that? He would always put on a brave face and make sure that Alan and I were alright. While I knew what I had to do. I forced a smile on my face as I reached into my backpack and pulled out the flashlight. Alan, listen to me. I'm going to make a distraction and try to lure that thing away. I know a trail that I can lead it to from here. You're going to wait here for a minute, then run home as fast as you can and call Mum and the police, alright?" Alan had a bewildered look on his face. But what about you? What if it gets you?" Crunch. "It won't get me, okay? I know what I'm doing. Just wait here a minute and then run. You got it?" He nodded. I gave him one final smile. "Alright, I love you, Alan. Here I go." With a quick pat on his shoulder, I leapt out from behind the rock and immediately sprinted off the trail. The footsteps that had been approaching us turned quickly and were now pursuing me. It was moving faster than before, giving up all pretense of a silent stalker. The forest still had some final glimmers of light as dusk descended over the mountain. The trees stood in stark contrast to the snow and allowed me to weave in and out of them easily. I had to trust that I would not slip on any ice beneath the snow, knowing that I didn't have time to watch my step. The animal was moving fast behind me, crashing through the brush of the forest with a loud cacophony. Soon, I emerged on a narrow off-trail, wheeling around to follow it forward. I'd hiked on this path a few times before, and I knew that it would lead me down the rest of the way. The animal burst onto the path only a few seconds after me. Its claws clacked noisily against the larger stones that marked the trail. I put my head down and continued to run as fast as I possibly could. My legs ached, and I felt every knot grow in the side of my stomach. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling sulphur, burning as it filled my lungs. But I didn't slow down, and I didn't look back. The animal was still behind me, but from the sound I could tell that it wasn't catching up. This caused me a new type of panic, thinking that maybe it was just trying to tire me out. But another, more terrifying thought occurred. What if the trail was just too small for it to move quickly? What if this thing was just too big? The trail I was on led through a clear cutting of trees. If it could freely move over those few acres... I had run out of time before I could make a decision. The clearing was up ahead, and there was no way for me to avoid it. Steeling myself for a final sprint, I plunged forward into the open. A field of stumps and snow opened up before me, shrouded in the darkness of the night and storm. The snow was deeper here, and I felt myself struggle to continue running. I was whipped by the wind and snow from all directions, with no trees to provide cover. Melted snow dripped into my eyes, making it hard for me to even see the exit. I just had to keep marching and make it to the trees again. Crunch! I stopped cold in my tracks and looked up to my side. It was too late. The monster stood barely 10 feet to my left, towering over me. It was bigger than any animal I had ever seen, standing at least 8 feet tall on all fours. Its fur was dirty white, with small flecks of black all over. Each foot had 4 large claws exposed from their end, almost half a foot each. Its head was large and angular, with a black nose at the centre and 2 long ears stretching high into the air. I was left staring at its piercing yellow eyes, too frightened to form a coherent thought. This was the end for me. And yet, the monster didn't move, just standing there and staring at me. Occasionally, its large flat tongue would shoot out and lick its face, but that's all it would do. Suddenly, in a flash of motion, it had leapt forward, batting me with one of its paws. It hit me with such force, it was like the force of a truck, flinging me down into the snow. Its claws shredded my jacket and bit into my skin. I grasped my arm and let out an agonised scream. It was only a flesh wound, but the blood was already beginning to spill everywhere. I looked up and saw the monster was once again staring at me expectantly, its head tilted, almost curiously. As I scrambled onto my feet, I began running towards the woods. As I moved, it again leapt at me, its claws outstretched. I managed to duck and narrowly avoid the hit, causing the beast to stumble forward. It turned slowly to face me again, tilting its head. The fucking thing was playing with its food. That's why it had fought the moose. It was looking for a fight. I wasn't going to last again against this thing. It was just going to drag out my death and make it as painful as possible. A choke sobbed escaped my throat as I realised how hopeless this was. The animal again sauntered closely to me, sniffing the air as it did. In a lightning motion, it snapped its jaw at me, almost taking a chunk out of my head. I fell flat on my ass and desperately began shuffling backwards away from it. The animal followed me slowly until I came to an abrupt stop as my back crashed against the stump. It was now close enough that I could feel its breath on my face. Its eyes stared intently at me, and I prepared for the worst. Suddenly, its ears twitched backwards. It lifted its head back and began surveying the area around us. I did the same, relieved that I would escape death for another moment. At first, nothing caught my ear until, far off, a rhythmic pattern emerged. It sounded almost like galloping. The monster turned its head to face noise, but by then, it was too late. A fully grown bull moose burst forth from the darkness of the forest and barreled headfirst into the monster, its antlers catching the monster in its stomach and knocking it violently into its back. The monster howled furiously while the moose let out a furious bellow and began trampling the beast. I was dumbstruck for a moment, having no idea how to react to this. My body took over for me. Standing up and immediately sprinting towards the tree line, I could hear the anguished howls as the 2 behemoths fought behind me, but I never turned back to look. Once I found a small trail again, I flew down the mountain as fast as I could in the conditions. My jacket was torn, and my left arm was beginning to grow numb from bleeding and exposure. I pushed through the pain and hobbled through the ever-increasing snow on the ground until I finally found the main trail that led back to my house. The whole trip likely took me about 45 minutes, the conditions and my injury slowing me down heavily. I saw blue and red flashing lights before I even saw my house. Alan had done exactly as I told him. I walked out of the woods and saw my mother pacing nervously on the back porch as an officer was furiously scribbling notes next to her. Neither saw me approach until I was halfway across the yard. My mum, tears in her eyes, ran straight at me for a hug, but held off at the last minute when she saw my arm. I walked into the house and saw Alan was sitting at the kitchen table with Daisy at his side, if you could believe it. She had apparently run to the neighbour's house, and they had returned her after Alan and I had left. My mother grabbed disinfectant spray and bandages from our medicine cabinet, while the officer took a statement from me. I told him everything that had happened, wincing every time my mother would dab my arm with rubbing alcohol. The officer simply nodded along politely, although he seemed dubious about my description of the animal. He agreed to let the game wardens know about what happened, and left late that night. My mum took me to the nearest hospital after this to get the scrapes on my arm stitched up. I could tell how upset she was with me, but for the moment she just seemed happy that both Alan and I were safe and sound. I didn't get to bed until around 1 in the morning, and even then I couldn't fall asleep. Images of the monster flashed in my mind as I tossed and turned. Just as I had finally settled down, probably an hour after I had laid down, a series of thundering howls came echoing from outside the house. At first I thought I was hallucinating, but in the morning both my mother was complaining about the noise, while Alan seemed as terrified as he had been on the mountain. The woods were searched thoroughly over the next week. No trace of any large predator was found, just 2 dead moose. I only heard the howling once after that, one afternoon about a week after my first encounter. It didn't matter. It was enough for me and the rest of my family, apparently. We're currently trying to move towards the coast, maybe somewhere in New Hampshire or Maine. I miss my slice of Vermont majesty, but sometimes it's simply time to move on. Wow, hope you guys enjoyed that story. As I say, please do let me know down below in the comments. Please do like and share, guys. Your support is absolutely incredible. And thank you to all of our brand new subscribers in the past week. Welcome to the DMT family. I hope you enjoy the back catalogue of stories we have here, and the wonderful community in the comments that we have as well. Remember, guys, if you're taking that hike up a mountain, bear in mind, keep an eye on what's around you, in the shadows or in the trees. And above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.